Hello and welcome to Rick's RC Flying Channel. This is episode 21 of the Sweet and Low build. This will be part 1 of building a standoff scale cockpit for the Sweet and Low. So let's get started. So I'm spray painting a cockpit module. It's basically more or less the first coat. You'll see on the side panels looks like what's tubing already. They are actually wooden dowels, and I'll be referring to them as tubes throughout the video. So while I'm working on the cockpit module, I have my 3D printer making parts for the instrument panel. These are the bezels, which have a very scale appearance because they're actually beveled inside, as you would see on a real bezel. Now, of course, the outside of the cockpit module didn't need to be painted, but I painted it anyways for what it's worth. So I'm going to be installing some more tubular pieces to the cockpit. And as you can see, the doweling has been pre-painted. And I like doing it this way because particularly if you're spray painting, if you put these dowels, in other words, these tubular pieces, for what it's worth, into the cockpit and it's not painted, when you're spray painting, it's rather difficult to get it to paint sort of under the tubing, and sometimes that would become visible. So if you pre-paint it, you'll end up always with a really nice interior finish. And so I'm just using here a fine-tooth saw blade just to kind of get clean cuts. And but you, of course, can cut it many different ways. Now this piece that I'm installing is going on the back side of the cockpit, and it will also feature a bracket in the center of it, and that will be to accommodate the shoulder harness of the pilot. The other thing I do on these kind of projects is I'll cut a millimeter or two oversize and then file to fit, and that way you always end up with a really nice snug fitting. So I'm just pre-fitting it right now, and it fits nicely in there. And the next step is going to be to install the bracket in the center of that tube, which again, as I mentioned before, it's for the shoulder harness for the pilot. So I'm just centering it right now. Now to install this bracket, I'm actually going to file away on that piece of tubing, or in other words, the doweling, so it's recessed into it. So I'm just kind of marking where I have to file, and I'll take the appropriate small file and start creating a groove. Now the back tubing is basically completed with the bracket, and I'm just temporarily installing it. And I'm going to put now some tubing on the side panels, and that tubing, one end towards the forward part of the bulkhead, is actually going to have a bracket installed, and the back end of the tube is going to mate with the rear tube. And now you could just, when it comes to gluing these pieces together, you could just butt them and glue them. But when I join the end of a tube to another tube, what I do is, it's very similar to what they do in a real airplane. I cut a groove, basically like a half moon shape, and that's the way it mates with the other tube. And then I create what would look like a weld joint. So here I'm just now getting the idea of the sizing I'm going to need to install that side tube. Now, of course, as I said, you could just butt it against there now and just glue it, but I like to cut the groove in it. So I'm going to take a round file, and I'm going to put this groove at the end of the dowel, and then it'll mate with the other dowel in the appropriate fashion. So now that we have the groove, you can see now the way it mates with the other tube. We're actually going to make it look a little bit later like a weld joint using the glue appropriately. So we're just pre-fitting it right now. So now we're going to measure to the length that I want. So I'm just going to cut it off there where I'm marking it with a pencil. And a bracket will be going there to support that piece of tubing here. So now I'm just fitting the brackets on the end of the tube, and once that's completed for both of them, they'll be glued into the cockpit module. Now that everything has been cut and it's fitted and all the brackets on the end of the side tubings have been glued, now it's time to glue the tubing in. So the back tubing and the side tubing is all going to be properly aligned and fitted. I'm going to be using thin CA. A little bit later on, we're actually going to use medium CA to create like weld joints. So now I'm just properly sizing everything in and making sure it's all properly aligned. So now we're going to install some tubing. It's going to be in a V shape, and it's going to be positioned, as you can see, on that bulkhead, and that's where the pilot's legs transit through that area, and there's going to be V tubing in between there. I thought I would just take a moment to mention quite a few of us have bandsaws, and of course it has an opening by the blade. And if you're cutting very small pieces, it's not unusual for those to fall in between that opening. So what I do is I take a piece of cardboard and I position it as you see, and I tape it to the bed, and that prevents any small pieces from falling through. So I thought I would just mention that as a tip. So the V tubing has been glued in place, and now I'm putting another tube in down the center line of the floor. So I'm just going to glue that in there with a little bit of thin CA. And now I'm going to take medium CA glue, and I'm going to, at all the joints, create a glue joint that once it's painted with the final coating, they're going to look like weld joints. Now I've made a cockpit seat, and it's made out of 1/32 thin plywood. And what I'm going to do is cover it with thin aluminum. It's called flight metal is the product name. And so I'm just, checking the fitting of the seat. And the white paper you see is actually the back of the flight metal. And when you end up peeling that white paper off, it's an adhesive side. So I've made templates, and I'm just cutting it out with an X-Acto knife. On the right hand side, you could already see one of the aluminum panels, which will make up the backrest. So now I'm just pre-fitting the pieces I've cut out on the seat before pulling the adhesive off and sticking it on, because once you do, you're pretty much not going to be able to pull it off. And so I'm just double checking that it all fits properly, and it's looking good. Now that goes on the back. Now there is a process where we have wooden tools and fiber tools. You can see the white ones and the wooden in the little tray there. And once you stick it on, then you basically, for no better way of describing it. You sort of rub and massage the aluminum onto your surface, and you work out any wrinkles as best as you can. And that's what I'm doing there right now. So now I have this tool, which is, sort of like a bit like a pizza cutter, and the round wheel at the end is serrated. And particularly when you roll it over flight metal or any type of thin aluminum, it does a nice job of simulating like rivet markings. And so I'm just going to put a couple on the bottom of this seat. So now I'm just going to take a little bit of steel wool and I'm going to dull the surface of the aluminum so it doesn't have quite a shiny look to it. So it gives it a little more of a used look to the seat. Eventually I'll be scuffing the cockpit itself and, putting wear marks on the floor, etc. So now I'm just doing the final spray coating of the cockpit module. Now the cockpit module is complete and we have a seat for the cockpit. I am now making a power quadrant and I'm using thin brass material, and I'm just now putting the outline shape there, and part of it will be soldered and part of it will be glued. So the area that's going to be soldered, I'm just using some sandpaper and taking the oxidation off. Just going to be soldering a back bracket onto this throttle quadrant. So I'm just using a jig holder to keep everything in place while I solder it. Now that the bracket is soldered on, I'm also going to solder on a piece of tubing. It's a copper piece to simulate the push rod from the throttle quadrant up to through the firewall. So now I'm going to be fabricating the actual throttle lever. So I'm going to cut a small strip out and it'll be part of the throttle quadrant. Now I'm going to drill a hole through it to attach the throttle lever, which will have a bolt going through there. So I'm just going to remove some of the oxidation that's on the brass. So that's what I'm just doing there with a abrasive buffing wheel. So just polishing it up. So now most of the components for the throttle quadrant are completed. The lever for the throttle has been finished, and now I've taken a piece of doweling and I've drilled a hole through it, and I'm going to stain it, and that is actually going to be the handle that the pilot will place his hand on to move the throttle. So now I'm making another bracket, which is actually what the power quadrant gets attached to. And this bracket then gets glued to the sidewall in the cockpit. So it's a piece of wood, and I'm going to cover it with the flight metal as well. Now for small projects like this, if you didn't want to use the flight metal product, you could use aluminum foil tape, which is quite often used in air conditioning ductwork or heating ductwork. And it's very economical, and it's great for little projects like this too because it has an adhesive back. Now it's covered with the aluminum, but I'm going to remove on the back of it, I'm going to remove some of the aluminum, and that'll be the area that'll actually be glued to the sidewall. You may notice three small holes in that bracket, and that's how the throttle quadrant will actually be bolted to this bracket. So now I'm just trial fitting the quadrant to the aluminum bracket, and just taking the small bolts that I have and just making sure everything fits properly before gluing the bracket to the sidewall. Now the bolts are more or less to simulate the attachment. There will be no nuts on the back of these bolts onto that bracket. The bolts are actually just going to be glued in with C-glue, and the back of it will be flush. Now the only bolt that actually has a nut on the end is the one with the wooden round handle. But all the rest, the bolts were put through, glued, and then the ends of it was cut flush to allow it to be glued onto the sidewall. So the quadrant has been totally assembled and glued into position. The next piece I'm going to make for the cockpit is a map box. So the pieces for the map box have all been cut out, and just trying to decide just exactly where on the sidewall I'll position the map box. And I'll just now glue it all together, and then we'll install it. So the map box has been glued together, and now I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy to glue the map box into the cockpit module. The reason I'm using epoxy and not C-glue is the 5-minute epoxy will give me the time to do any little final alignment that is going to be necessary. By using C-glue would be a little too risky in case I don't quite put the map box in the exact position that it needs to be in. Well, now the map box is glued into position on the sidewall, and the next thing is the control yoke. And so that's what's basically going to be assembled here now. So I've made the control column, and it's been painted, and it's just drying right now. And now I have a small balsa block that I'm going to be covering in leather, and that's going to be the base of the control column. So now I'm mounting the control column into the cockpit. The base has already been glued in. Actually, this is the second control column. You can see one lying on the table. I was not happy the way that turned out. So in my hands right now is the one that I'm going to be installing. So I'm just comparing them, and I like the second one better. So that's the one that's going in there. So now I'm going to glue the control column into the cockpit. And again, I'm going to use epoxy just so it gives me a little extra time so I can get it aligned the way I want. Well, the cockpit is slowly coming together, and remembering it is only a standoff scale cockpit, so the amount of detail is limited. However, I still have to make these seatbelt brackets, and the seat belts and the shoulder harness have to be added. Also, a windshield is going to have to be made for the airplane. And I will also add various wear markings like scuffing the floor, so forth. One thing about the airplane is that no matter what angle or view you take, you can see the cockpit. So it's kind of fun to create something like this for this airplane. Now there will be a part 2 of the giant sweet and low cockpit build, which will describe on how to fabricate the instrument panel. So if you have any questions or comments, like always, I do appreciate it. And if you liked the video, please select like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.